All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to combat brain drain with a knowledge management system. So depending on where this conversation takes us today, we might spend 20, 30 minutes chatting with our guest here. If the folks that are joining us, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A. We will make sure that we follow along with those, and then at the end, we'll try to answer any of the questions that you might have. So just to begin with, my name is Brad Doss. I'm a public account executive here at Quorum. In my role, I get to interact a lot with our Department of Defense clients. I'm super excited to have a guest from one of those agencies. So I've had the pleasure of working with Rudy Bravo over the last 2 years or so. And I feel like every time I meet with him, I'm taking a master class in how to manage a professional government affairs team. Rudy comes to us today from the Marine Corps Installation Command, or MCICOM. He's a legislative affairs specialist there. But prior to joining the Marine Corps' legislative team, he was with the Air Force Director of Legislative Liaison, which supported the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Chief of Space Operations. Rudy's been recognized for his work in those agencies with several civilian awards, the Air Force Exemplary Civilian Service Award Medal and the Air Force Civilian Achievement Award. He might be able to tell you a story behind some of those. Prior to joining or working with the military, he served in roles at Arizona State University, both in Arizona and Tempe and in DC. And he also completed a congressional fellowship with a member of the Arizona congressional delegation. Prior to that, Rudy was a Marine. So, and I'll add on a side note, if you want to know anything about tequila, Rudy might be the gentleman to talk to. So, Rudy, with that, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to say before we jump into today's conversation?
Good afternoon, Brad, and to everyone. Thanks for the intro. That's a big intro, so I appreciate it, though.
Yeah, well, people will find out here as we start to talk. You know, you've got a wealth of knowledge, and it's always fun to talk with you. So, but today, the focus of today's call or today's webinar is we're going to spend some time talking about brain drain. Now, I know that the conversation, because of your experience in the military, is going to be slightly skewed or focused on personnel turnover within the military. I do think it is germane to pretty much any government affairs team. If you think about it, when somebody leaves an organization, right, you know, whether they leave for retirement, they find another job, what have you, the knowledge that resides in that person's brain leaves with them. So we'll spend some time defining what that means. And then afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about how a knowledge management system will help you address that. After that, maybe Rudy can share some tips on, you know, the best practices for knowledge management systems that can combat brain drain. And if time allows, we can even get into some of the particulars about maybe some software and tools that are available to help automate and stream knowledge that process. Does that sound good to you, Rudy?
Sounds good, Brad. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so to begin, let's just define brain drain. You know, so you know, before we really get into too depth, you know, in your eyes, you know, Rudy, how do you outline and define what brain drain is and knowledge management systems?
Well, for me, brain drain, and I've seen this over the years at the Pentagon, it is a loss or disruption of interpersonal relationships that we work to establish with not only the member, but very importantly, the staffers. And we all do know that some members and some staffers have been there for a couple of decades. And for us, you know, we're not there that long. With a lot of our military members, our officers and senior enlisted, they're there for only a year or 2 years at the most. But the institutional knowledge within Congress is vast. And so a lot of times we actually at a disadvantage because we haven't been there as long. So that's my definition of brain drain. And knowledge management is the collecting of legislative intelligence through congressional engagements, one-on-one, of course, the congressional public records, and it's documenting all that information, that vast knowledge, and also being able to recall all that information from past months or years. So that's my definition of the knowledge management and how we use it within the Pentagon.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for those that are on this webinar that maybe don't have super familiarity with how the military works, can you describe, how these legislative affairs teams are populated? So, as I understand it, you get somebody that might be an infantry officer, and then next thing you know, he gets assigned to legislative affairs within the Pentagon. What's that process like? And just describe how they work through that system, because I imagine there's a heavy lift on the front end with new people, and then of course, as those people are leaving, you're losing potential knowledge once they've gotten themselves up to speed.
Yep, and so every branch is a little bit different of how they select it, but a lot of these officers, they are interviewed, they're vetted, and I like to say they are the future leaders of the military, and that's why we want to get them in front of Congress. So we get infantry officers, nurses, civil engineers, pilots, navigators, all sorts. So there is no special career field within the military. It's if you're selected, you do a little bit more training, and then either you're assigned to the military legislative affairs team, or you do a fellowship on the Hill. So we do get a wide background, and for a lot of our, I'm going to call action officers, this is their first introduction to the legislative process. So like, for example, I studied political science, I studied this in college. So this was a natural fit. But for a lot of our action officers, this is brand new to them. And so we try to train them up and give them as much knowledge as possible in a quick amount of time.
So you've got a major hurdle to overcome that might be unique in this particular industry. Just thinking about brain drain in general and why it's an issue for public sector. Thinking about the cyclical nature of the folks that work within the military, and what you sort of alluded to earlier, which was the institutional knowledge that Congress has, but the folks that are on the Hill are playing catch up and then getting up to speed, and then once they're up to speed, they're gone. So is there a difference in how it works in your role here at the military and in your prior roles, like in the university world? How does that compare?
So yeah, it is a 90-day difference. So when I was with the university, I was there for 7 years. My boss and the university president, they've been there for several decades. And prior to that, they worked with Congress. After 7 years, I was still the new guy in the office. So that tells you how much institutional knowledge was held by my two bosses. And now within the military, after 5 years with the Air Force, I was, one of the old guys in the Air Force. And so there is a big 90-day difference. Again, it's just the unique nature of the military that after 2 years, the officer, they're enlisted, has to move on to their next assignment, their next command. And it's all based on the needs of the military. And with the academia, where my previous world was, it's very stable, and you can stay there, until you retire if you want. But that was the difference between academia and the military. So,
well, thinking of that, so those folks that are there, maybe somebody does stay until they retire, but when they do, if there isn't an effective system in place, does that throw the organization into a little bit of a quandary as to how do we maintain or call up all the information that was in this person's head, that's moved on after 20 years? Could you see that as an issue as well?
Yes. When I first joined the Air Force, 5.5 years ago, we did not have a very good system of documenting congressional engagement. We were trying to develop our own software, but we would have to hand jam everything. If we saw news a press release that was important to us, we would scan it, upload it. But I just looked on Sunday alone, members of Congress put out 1,000 social media statements on the Sunday alone. There was just no way we could, keep on top of everything. And so the Air Force didn't have anything at first. It was maybe Word documents put on Excel, on SharePoint. But basically, that information was lost to the wind after a couple months or a year. And so we would have to start from scratch again. So it was a big blind spot that we had. But glad to report that issue has been resolved now, and that we could actually go back 5 years of past engagements and one-on-one coffee dates or things like that we have documented now. So.
And not only the loss of knowledge, but I have to imagine that without some sort of an effective process or tool in place, the time commitment, the pure time suck that it would take to do that work. You're just talking about all the social media posts that the Pentagon put out over the weekend. Can you talk about how having a knowledge management tool in place can help not only maintain institutional knowledge, but also lighten people's workload?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in working smarter, not harder. So previously, our action officers, after an engagement, they would have to wait until they were back at their computer desk and enter all the engagements. And if they were on a trip or something, it could be either days or weeks before they could sort of enter their congressional engagement. After a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you start losing accuracy of that engagement. And now, as soon as that engagement is over, and we've actually had examples, or right in the middle of the congressional engagement, the meeting, our action officers were actually on their phones typing the engagement as it was happening in real time. And if we have that capability, then we know that those engagements recorded are 100% accurate because it's taking place right now and it's fresh in their minds.
Yeah, that's a good point. To that, I mean, so not only is it important for the folks that are doing the frontline work, but it's also important for leadership, right? Because they have the ability then to see those results probably in a little bit more accurate fashion and more timely. I think you even told me a story about a CODEL once, and for those of you who don't know, CODEL is a congressional delegation where one of your action officers, I think this is right after you joined the Air Force and brought on a new system, but they were in Africa for several weeks. And to your point earlier, can you recount that story for me?
Oh, sure. Happy to. So I think we had the software about a year, and one of our action officers, took to the software like a fish to water. She loved it. So they were in Africa, and so she was talking to the spouse of a member, and they were just chatting during sort of a side trip. And our action officer collected some pretty good intel from the spouse. I think it had to do with a family member in the Air Force. Now, this is information, it wasn't public, but it was a little nugget of info. And, at the time, it was just gossip and, a spouse and an Air Force officer talking. But she was able, as soon as they broke off, she was able to go on her phone, enter the engagement, and within seconds, we here at the Pentagon, we had that information. And we could have the ability to store that little nugget of data that might come in handy in a couple months or a year later on. And we have it exactly word by word, that took place a year ago in Africa. So that was starting to sort of pay off, and people start to realize how good it was to enter these engagements right when they happen or soon after they conclude.
Yeah. So what, speaking of, how important, maintaining knowledge is, but what in knowledge management, like what information is most important to maintain? Is there anything that's more important than others? I mean, is it relationships? Is it just general data? Is it processes, standard operating procedures? What in your mind is most important, or do they sort of hold the same weight?
Oh, it's all that data, all that information is actually equally important because, of course, every member, every staffer processes information differently. They all have their different ways of how they like data, information, meetings process. And so I've always been the strong believer of having too much data is a good problem to have. I would rather have too much data than not enough information. And so, yeah, I've always been a believer that all that information, that knowledge has equal weight because every member is different. All of our principals are also different. They process information differently. And with the software with Quorum, it allows us to tailor the information, the end results, to a way that our principals can process that information, and we could have tailor-made for their specifications.
That's a good segue into my next question, which was, having something that's an effective system that's in place help you. You have any instances where it's helped you maintain a relationship across directors or leadership? So if, for example, somebody has a relationship with a member of Congress, and then the general moves on, right? I guess my point is, I'm sort of making your point that you just said, which is, that as they move on, have you had any instances where that's really helped you maintain those relationships on the Hill?
Yeah, a good example, Senator Inhofe, he just retired, but he was in Congress for 35 years. Now that's a senator and representative that has an amazing memory, and because he could bring up meetings that we've had with him years ago. And by that time, the new general, wasn't there in the room. The secretary wasn't in the room. So we're relying on, the senator to tell us, what was discussed 5 years ago, because we had no record. And so that has certainly helped us to sort of play catch up and be prepared prior to going into these meetings with members and staff that have been there for years. Of course, much longer than the Secretary of the Air Force or elected leader. And another example that I want to provide is a couple of years ago, we actually had a senator in the Northeast, and she kept bringing up this aircraft, but no one could figure out why did she have such an interest in this aircraft. Her state wasn't connected to it. There was no bases in her state. We couldn't see anything. She was not prior military. But turns out her husband was a pilot, and it wasn't public information. It wasn't on her bio, but it was something that, it's that little nugget of information that we were able to capture, input, and it helped us with future engagements with her. And because she never made it publicly known of, why she took such a strong interest into a certain aircraft. So,
no, that's fascinating. I mean, it is. It's essentially. I mean, the work is personal relationships, right? So it is
exactly.
that's very powerful. So I guess maybe if you could describe, the role technology has played in your various positions, particularly in the military here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so again, just going back, I've been a strong believer in working smarter, not harder, because a lot of these engagements do take up a lot of time doing the research. And so we've always been in the past couple of years, we've allowed the software to do the heavy lift, to do the research, to allow our action officers to sort of start connecting the dots of all the engagements, so they have a better picture. Let the software do the heavy lift and all the research and all the scooping of information, and let the action officers actually sit back, analyze the amount of data, and start picking out the information that they need. Before, it was Google search, Wikipedia. It was looking for that little nugget of information, and they would spend hours. And the workload that our action officers have is actually pretty heavy, because not only are they doing their legislative affairs, but they have to keep up with their other military duties, their other responsibilities, deployments, and things like that. So if we could give some time back to the staff member, the team member, that's valuable. It's, time is a finite resource here.
That's interesting. So that you essentially have used in this instance Quorum, but it could be any system to make their lives a little easier.
Yes.
Sounds like, right? Okay. What about I guess getting to that point, like any system or process or whatever, a knowledge management system is only as good as its users, right? It's only as good as the data that's input. Do you have any tips on how you get, particularly maybe those newer members or newer action officers or liaisons, committed to using it? How do you ensure adoption?
So in the military, if you mention training, I guarantee you people will roll their eyes. Here in the military, we are very famous for training. And so, I could tell you endless stories of brand new officers. They cringe at the idea of training, and they kind of blow me off at first because they don't want to spend hours in front of a computer. But once I show them, for example, I used to do, and I got good feedback, like on a smart board TV screen where they could actually touch the screen. They were actually able to retain the knowledge even faster because they were able to drive the training. And I realized that certain officers who had that type of training hands-on, they were driving the software, and I was sort of just to the side, that they adopted the software even faster, and then they realized it's actually user-friendly. And it wasn't like the typical military training where they sit through slides and it takes 2 hours. Again, just goes back to my academic training when I was trained at the university, how it's hands-on, and the philosophy is, we want to educate you, and we're not going to leave you alone until you're comfortable using the software. And once they see how user-friendly it is, a lot of our officers have taken to it. Like I said, that one officer in Africa, she took to it right away and started adopting the iPhone application of it.
So it's a process of doing rather than seeing.
Yes, I've let the action officers sort of drive the training, and because they get to become comfortable instead of being told, then it's a big difference.
And then they sort of see the advantage then of the speed of data, right? So the ability to grab what they need in a quick fashion, as opposed to, you alluded to earlier, like the Google searches and everything else that can take an inordinate amount of time. I know that what a lot of your folks do is prep leadership for engagements, right? And in terms of that, how can you use a knowledge management system to save them the hours, days, or even weeks of prepping for congressional testimony or what have you, using an effective knowledge management system?
Yeah, part of that training that I've always included is to show them how they could tailor the software to meet their needs, to ignore the information that's useless to them, and to bring forward the information that's vital to them, what's important to them, and to show them that the software is not, one size fit all, but to customize it to them, how they process information, how do they receive it. And once they see that, then they could tailor their products, their research paper for their leadership or their principal or their colonel, whoever is requesting the data. And so once they see that it can be tailored to meet their needs and their comfort level, then they bring about a better product, a better research product.
Cool. I remember, particularly in your work at Air Force, most recently, that as different Congresses are in session, or as the military is in a different fiscal year, sometimes that priorities or issues change. Can you talk a little bit about how using a knowledge management system can help you maintain those sort of portfolios of what's important to Marine Corps Installation Command right now, or what's important to the Air Force right now? Is there something within a tool that can help manage that?
Yes, so and I've showed the action officers how we could tailor the software to be on the lookout for certain issues, or certain topics. And I like to use the term, it serves as a tripwire that once we start seeing certain issues or topics that are popping up along certain members, that sort of tells us we should be on the lookout and sort of be proactive instead of being reactive. Because a lot of times in previous years, over 5 years ago, we were very reactive, and so now we could sort of get ahead when we could see a pattern. For example, the forever chemicals in drinking water, that's a big issue for the past couple of years. And if we're starting to see a spike, that tells us we need to start paying attention more. That's coming up in Michigan or Southwest. And so that's how we've been using issue management to give us a heads up that something's coming down the pipeline. So we're not telling leadership, giving them the bad news after the fact, and sort of we could give them a little bit of a heads up.
So before it gets to the state at which the Camp Lejeune thing is at right now, right?
Yeah, correct.
As an example, right? Okay. Well, hey, we're coming up on the end here, but I just wanted to see if there was anything else that you had any other, you had alluded to it earlier just a few minutes ago about, customization, customizing a knowledge management system by user. Is there anything that you've done over your career to customize these tools to bring in different data, right? To things that don't necessarily sit in the system?
Yes. So within the Air Force, we did customize the software quite a bit because we would get a lot of feedback from different teams and saying, can we add this, suspense dates, due dates, or can we tag other team members or teams that they might not have been in the engagement in the room itself, but it alerts them saying, hey, your issue came up, you should be aware of this. And so over the years, we have been customizing the software. Even after 5 years, we're still tweaking it to meet our needs and meet the needs of our director. How do they process information? And that's a great value in the software because everyone's different. And now that I'm in with the Marine Corps, their custom tools are very different than the Air Force. So it's vastly different among the teams, but it works for every branch because it's customized to meet their needs. Like with the Marine Corps, it's great for the Marine Corps, but it wouldn't meet the needs of the Air Force and vice versa. So.
Great. That's fascinating. And that actually leads us there. There was one question I think that came up, and it looks like somebody asked whether or not the DoD and other government entities, share knowledge amongst each other. So I don't know if you want to address that or how that's looked at within the DoD.
Yeah, we don't share too much information among the branches. It's still like the Army-Navy football game. It's the competition. And so, but right now, I personally think it would be valuable if just all the branches sort of share a little bit of information. But that's just wishful thinking on my part. That's something I learned at the university, that actually sharing information is actually a good thing. But here within the Pentagon, it's not such it doesn't go over too well. But maybe in a couple of years. So
Yeah, there's still those silos, right?
Exactly.
They don't want to cross over. And to answer that further, the question a little further too, just yeah, each individual customer of say Quorums within the DoD has their own instance. That said, there is some collaboration, and a lot. Rudy should get a lot of credit for this. The DoD does regularly now meet with the various entities and share best practices, particularly Quorum. So while they're not sharing information, they are sharing, their specific data. They're sharing how they use a system or a knowledge management system. It could be any system. So, okay, so we're getting up towards the end of our time here. I want to make sure that we answer any other questions, but before we do, we're going to put up a really quick poll. If you would please answer that if you can, and then let's go into the chat and see if any other questions came up that we might be able to answer. Okay. All right. Okay, so I've got a question here. Rudy, we've had team members leave and no one knows how to interpret their notes. Any tips on keeping notes organized?
Yeah, it's more, the note taking is an art, not so much a science. But we've been able to customize our fields of when they enter engagement, of selecting certain fields, drop down menus, because we want to encourage our action officers to put all information in there. And, they might think, this little bit of data is useless, it just came up, but it may pay off in a couple months or a couple of years. And so we want, and we customize it to make it easier for the action officers. And so, yeah, we've had action officers sitting in the meeting, entering these notes quickly in a matter of seconds or minutes. And of course, they could always go back and edit these notes and congressional engagement. But it's making it easier, working smarter and not harder. And so I've gotten feedback from Air Force officers saying, yeah, this is easy. It's like I could do it on my iPad. I don't have to wait until I come back to my desk and enter the information. They could do it in a cab ride or the ride over from the Hill. So.
Yeah, and further to that question, do you set it up any sort of guardrails, on what you can and can't enter in terms of? I was thinking of like issue areas, right? Somebody might call, FA-18 something or FA-18 whatever. The different. How do you address that?
Yeah, so we do deal with a lot of classified information. We certainly don't want it on Discord channel. I'm just giving an example.
Yeah.
So we do a good number of our engagements are sensitive in nature. And of course, we don't put anything sensitive or classified on our notes, but we just leave enough crumbs to say, which member of Congress did we brief? And if you want more information, please contact this action officer and they could give you more data, or you can have access to the secure server held within the Pentagon. But of course, you can't read all the classified information, but it just gives you enough of who did we engage, when, and by who, and that's enough to sort of establish a track record, a history of who did we engage and when.
Oh, that's great. Okay, just a couple more quick questions here. How can I get buy-in from my boss and team members that this is important?
So yes. So once we explain to the action officers, because a lot of times they think it's like, as soon as I enter my engagement notes, no one's going to read it. And then we could show them the dashboard and say, yeah, actually the general or the director, they actually read your engagements every single day. Then they say, okay, I should put accurate information or better notes, because my boss, the general, is reading my notes, is reading my engagements. And so our leadership have a way to read these engagements every single day, where they could start to see a pattern of who are we engaging, what type of engagements, and they have this data right on their desktop and they see it every single day.
That's great. Okay, so one last question. This one, you'll get a kick out of this. you might know who sent this to. Is working for the Air Force really a lot better than working for the Marine Corps? And you don't have to answer that if you don't
So
want
I've
to.
learned working for the Hill. I've learned these two words, no comments.
Yeah, there you go. And I think we'll leave the webinar with that today. So Rudy, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. For those of you that are here with us, thank you very much for attending today. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about knowledge management or Quorum in general, feel free to reach out to us. And thanks again, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.